France, a country often celebrated for its rich culture, exquisite cuisine, and iconic landmarks. But beyond the romanticized image of Parisian streets and the Eiffel Tower lies a history that is far more complex and troubling. We often hear about its ideas of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. These principles were enshrined during the French Revolution, a time when the nation sought to redefine itself and its values. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen became a symbol of these lofty ideals. But there's a dark side to this story. While France was preaching liberty at home, it was imposing tyranny abroad. The same nation that championed human rights was also responsible for some of the most brutal acts of colonial oppression. It's a story of empire, of harsh takeovers, and of cruel treatment of others. French colonialism spanned continents, from Africa to Asia, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The French Empire was built on the backs of those it subjugated, exploiting their resources and labor for its own gain. From the sunny beaches of Algeria to the jungles of Vietnam, the story of French colonialism is filled with pain and suffering. In Algeria, the French military used brutal tactics to suppress resistance, leading to countless deaths and widespread destruction. In Vietnam, the French imposed harsh economic policies that impoverished the local population and fueled resentment. France pretended to be a civilizing force, but it used its military power to control unsuspecting people. The French justified their actions by claiming they were bringing civilization to backward societies, but in reality they were imposing their own culture and values by force. It wanted to control not just land, but also cultures, languages, and even who people thought they were. French missionaries played a key role in this cultural domination, spreading Christianity and undermining local religions and traditions. The colonial administration enforced French as the official language, erasing indigenous languages and identities. The human cost was huge, leaving behind a legacy of pain that still hurts today. The scars of French colonialism are still visible in the former colonies, where economic disparities, social tensions, and cultural dislocation continue to affect people's lives. The struggle for independence was long and bloody, and the wounds of that struggle have yet to fully heal. France wanted power and resources. The desire for expansion was driven by a combination of economic interests, national pride, and a belief in cultural superiority. The French government and military leaders saw the acquisition of new territories as a way to enhance their nation's prestige and secure valuable resources that could fuel their industrial growth. This ambition was not unique to France. It was a common theme among European powers during the age of imperialism. So it started taking over other countries. The process of colonization often began with exploratory missions, followed by military expeditions that established control over strategic areas. These expeditions were meticulously planned and executed, with the aim of quickly subduing local resistance and establishing French authority. The expansion of the French Empire was marked by a series of military campaigns that extended French influence across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Its armies had better weapons and easily defeated anyone who fought back. The French military was equipped with the latest technology of the time, including advanced firearms, artillery, and naval vessels. This technological superiority gave them a significant advantage over the indigenous forces they encountered. Battles were often one-sided, with French troops overwhelming their opponents through sheer firepower and tactical expertise. The use of modern weaponry and disciplined military tactics allowed the French to establish control over vast territories with relative ease. Treaties were forced upon people, often with threats of violence. These treaties were typically drafted by French officials and presented to local leaders as non-negotiable terms. The threat of military action loomed large, compelling many leaders to sign away their sovereignty in exchange for promises of protection or economic benefits. However, these promises were rarely honored, and the treaties served primarily to legitimize French control and exploitation of the colonized regions. The people who already lived in these places were seen as less important and were treated very badly. Indigenous populations were often subjected to harsh treatment, including forced labor, displacement from their ancestral lands, and suppression of their cultural practices. The colonial administration imposed strict regulations that favored French settlers and businesses, leading to widespread social and economic inequalities. The local populations were marginalized and their voices silenced, as the French authorities prioritized their own interests over the well-being of the colonized peoples. Their lands were stolen, their resources taken, and their way of life destroyed. The French colonial system was designed to extract maximum value from the colonized territories. Natural resources such as minerals, timber, and agricultural products were harvested and exported to France, often with little regard for the environmental or social impact on the local communities. Traditional ways of life were disrupted as the colonial economy imposed new forms of labor and production. The exploitation of land and resources led to long-term consequences for the indigenous populations, including environmental degradation and loss of cultural heritage. France built its empire on the suffering of these people, using forced labor and racist ideas to justify its actions. The colonial administration relied heavily on forced labor to build infrastructure, extract resources, and maintain control over the territories. Indigenous workers were often subjected to brutal working conditions with little or no compensation. At the same time, colonial propaganda promoted the idea of French superiority and the civilizing mission, portraying the colonized peoples as backward and in need of French guidance. These racist ideologies were used to justify the exploitation and oppression of the indigenous populations, reinforcing the power dynamics of the colonial system. The French believed they were doing a good thing, bringing progress to the world. Many French colonialists genuinely believed that their actions were benevolent and that they were bringing civilization, education, and modernity to the colonized regions. Missionary activities aimed to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, while educational programs sought to instill French language and culture. However, these efforts often disregarded and undermined the existing cultural and social structures of the indigenous peoples. The notion of progress was framed in terms of French values and interests, rather than the needs and aspirations of the local communities. But this was just an excuse to take what they wanted and show off their power. The rhetoric of progress and civilization masked the underlying motives of economic gain and political dominance. The French Empire was built on the exploitation of colonized peoples and their resources, with little regard for their rights or well-being. Displays of military power and colonial dominance served to reinforce the authority of the French state and intimidate any potential resistance. The legacy of French colonialism is a complex and often painful history, marked by the suffering and resilience of the indigenous populations who endured its impact. Algeria shows the worst side of French colonialism. Taken over in 1830, Algeria became a place where French people moved to and used the land and its people. The Algerians lost their land and many became poor and hopeless. A system was put in place that made Algerians second-class citizens. They had no rights and were constantly mistreated by the French. The French tried to erase Algerian culture. They didn't allow Arabic in schools or government. Algerian children were forced to use French names and follow French customs. This attack on their identity hurt Algerians deeply. After over 100 years of harsh rule, Algerians fought back in 1954. The French had colonized Algeria in 1830, and for over a century, the Algerian people endured severe oppression and exploitation. The French colonial administration imposed heavy taxes, seized lands, and suppressed any form of dissent. The Algerian culture and identity were under constant threat as the French sought to assimilate the population. By the mid-20th century, the desire for independence had reached a boiling point. The National Liberation Front, FLN, emerged as the leading force in the struggle for freedom. And on November 1st, 1954, they launched a series of coordinated attacks against French military and civilian targets, marking the beginning of the Algerian War for Independence. The Algerian War for Independence was a long and terrible fight. It lasted for nearly 8 years, from 1954 to 1962, and was characterized by brutal guerrilla warfare, widespread atrocities, and significant loss of life. The FLN employed hit-and-run tactics, ambushes and sabotage to challenge the French forces, who were better equipped and more numerous. The conflict quickly escalated, drawing in civilians and turning villages into battlegrounds. The French government, determined to maintain its colonial grip, responded with overwhelming military force, leading to a cycle of violence and retribution that devastated the country. The French army wanted to win no matter what, and used terrifying tactics against the Algerian people. They implemented a strategy of collective responsibility where entire communities were punished for the actions of a few. This included mass arrests, summary executions, and the destruction of property. The French military also established a network of internment camps where suspected FLN supporters were detained under harsh conditions. Psychological warfare, including the use of propaganda and misinformation, was employed to demoralize the Algerian resistance and sow distrust among the population. Villages were destroyed, people were killed, and torture was common. The French forces conducted ratissage operations or sweeping raids to root out FLN fighters. These operations often resulted in the indiscriminate killing of civilians and the burning of homes and crops. Torture became a systematic tool used by the French military and police to extract information and intimidate the population. Methods included electric shocks, waterboarding, and severe beatings. The widespread use of torture was later documented and condemned by international human rights organizations. The world was shocked by what the French did. Reports of atrocities and human rights abuses began to surface, drawing international condemnation. Prominent intellectuals, activists, and political leaders spoke out against the French actions in Algeria. Protests and demonstrations were held in major cities around the world, calling for an end to the violence and for Algerian independence. The global outcry put pressure on the French government and highlighted the moral and ethical implications of their colonial policies. They arrested huge numbers of people, tortured them, and killed them without trials. The French authorities conducted mass roundups, detaining thousands of Algerians suspected of supporting the FLN. Many of these detainees were held without charge or trial and subjected to brutal interrogation techniques. Extrajudicial killings were also common, with many prisoners simply disappearing, their bodies never found. The lack of due process and the arbitrary nature of the arrests and executions further fueled the anger and resentment among the Algerian population. They put people in terrible camps. The internment camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and lacked basic necessities. Detainees were often subjected to forced labor, inadequate food, and medical care. The conditions in these camps were so dire that many prisoners died from disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. The existence of these camps and the inhumane treatment of detainees became a symbol of the broader injustices of French colonial rule in Algeria. They used napalm and other awful weapons that caused widespread death and destruction. The French military employed heavy artillery, airstrikes, and chemical weapons to suppress the Algerian resistance. Napalm, a highly flammable and devastating incendiary weapon, was used to destroy entire villages and forests, leaving behind a trail of death and devastation. The use of such weapons not only caused immediate casualties, but also had long-term environmental and health impacts on the affected areas. Hundreds of thousands of Algerians died, and many more were hurt, both physically and emotionally. The war left deep scars on the Algerian society, with families torn apart, communities destroyed, and a generation traumatized by the violence. The psychological impact of the war was profound, with many survivors suffering from long-term mental health issues. The struggle for independence came at a tremendous cost, but it also forged a strong sense of national identity and resilience among the Algerian people. The war finally ended in 1962 with the signing of the Evian Accords, granting Algeria its long-awaited independence. To make things even worse, France tested nuclear bombs in the Algerian Sahara Desert. Between 1960 and 1966, 19 nuclear bombs exploded there, exposing people to dangerous radiation. The effects of this are still seen today, with more cancer and other illnesses in those areas. These tests show how little the French government cared about the Algerian people. Even after Algeria became independent, France wouldn't admit what it had done. The poisoned land and sick people are a